Texas, June 1945. The transport truck rolled through the gates of Camp Huntsville, and 18 German women stared through the wire mesh at something that made no sense. Standing at the checkpoint was an American soldier. Uniform pressed sharp clipboard in one hand and a Colt 45 holstered at her hip. The weapon sat there casual as a wristwatch, like it belonged. One prisoner laughed. Another whispered in disbelief. A third. Margaret Fisher, 34. Luftwaffe communications officer with a scar bisecting her left cheek leaned forward and said what they were all thinking. That can't be real. Women don't carry weapons. Where are the men? In Germany, women served the war effort in factories and hospitals, certainly. But never with guns. Never with authority over prisoners. Never in positions that suggested they might be, God forbid, equal to men in domains reserved for male strength and judgment.
What these 18 women would learn in the coming months wouldn't just challenge their assumptions about American guards. It would shatter everything they'd been taught about women, about weakness, about the natural order of things. And it would start with bacon. By the end of her first month at Camp Huntsville, Margaret Fisher would request a private meeting with Sergeant Catherine Brennan, not to complain, not to protest, but to apologize. The path to that apology would require her to question every belief she'd carried across the Atlantic. But first, she had to survive the shock of arrival. Margaret stepped off the truck into Texas heat that hit like a physical wall. At 34, she'd been a mid-level communications officer in the Luftwaffe. Not a combat soldier, but military nonetheless. Smart enough to decode radio transmissions, organized enough to manage a communications hub in Hamburg, and indoctrinated enough to believe that German culture represented the pinnacle of civilization and proper social order. The scar on her left cheek came from a bombing raid that had killed her entire unit except for her. She wore it like a badge proof she'd survived what others hadn't. In the prisoner hierarchy forming among the 18 women, she was already emerging as the unelected leader, the one others looked to, the one who'd speak first. Sergeant Catherine Brennan stood 5'7" in army boots. At 28, she'd been in the Women's Army Corps for 3 years, long enough to have heard every skeptical comment, every dismissive joke, every suggestion that female guards were a wartime experiment that would evaporate the moment real men came home from the front. She'd heard it all, and she'd proven them wrong every single time. Now she watched the German prisoners emerge from the truck. Stiff, exhausted, confused, and she recognized the particular expression crossing their faces. She'd seen it 24 times with previous transports. That look of cognitive dissonance when reality contradicts everything you thought you knew about how the world works. Brennan approached with clipboard ready. "I am Sergeant Catherine Brennan," she said in carefully practiced German pronunciation, learned specifically for this duty. "I am the senior guard officer for this compound. My fellow officers and I will be responsible for your custody, your security, and your daily management. We are not temporary. We are not administrative support. We are your guards." Margaret stared. The silence stretched heavy and uncomfortable. "You," Margaret finally managed in broken English. "You carry weapon. This is permitted woman guard." "This is required," Brennan replied evenly. "Female guards for female prisoners. Same standards. Same authority. Same protocols as any military police unit. Your gender doesn't make you less of a security risk. Our gender doesn't make us less capable of maintaining custody." Margaret Fisher didn't believe her. None of them did. They assumed this was temporary theatre, that real guards, male guards, would appear once processing was complete. They were wrong. And the moment they discovered exactly how wrong would come 3 days later in the laundry facility over a simple question of production standards. If you or your father served in the military during World War II, or if you remember hearing stories about German POWs in America, you'll recognize what happened next. The clash between propaganda and reality. Between what people were taught to believe and what they actually experienced when they encountered real Americans, real American values, and real American kindness. This is the story of 18 German women who arrived at a Texas POW camp expecting brutality, expecting male guards, expecting confirmation of everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about American weakness and degeneracy. Instead, they found female soldiers who would challenge not just their assumptions about America, but their entire understanding of what women were capable of. And it would change them forever. Stick with me, because what happens when a 5'4" American corporal faces down a situation that would have terrified most men will shock you. But before we get to that moment, we need to understand where these women came from, what they'd been taught, and why the sight of Sergeant Brennan's holstered Colt 45 represented something more dangerous to them than any weapon, the possibility that everything they believed was a lie. By June 1945, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. But the machinery of demobilization moved slowly. Millions of displaced persons, hundreds of thousands of prisoners waiting for repatriation, and an allied bureaucracy struggling to process it all. Camp Huntsville in central Texas had been converted from a training facility into one of a handful of camps housing female POWs, not soldiers who'd carried rifles. Germany had never put women in combat, but military auxiliary personnel, communication workers, medical staff and civilian detainees classified as requiring secure custody. These 18 women represented a cross-section of Germany's female war effort. Ages ranged from 22 to 41. Some had been captured in uniform, others had been detained in occupied territories. All had been processed through the same system, issued the same grey, shapeless prison dresses, and told they'd remain in American custody until repatriation could be arranged. Could be months, could be longer.
Margarete Fischer had grown up in Hamburg in a middle-class family. Father an accountant, mother a homemaker, everything orderly and proper according to German traditions. She'd been educated, trained as a secretary, then recruited into Luftwaffe communications in 1942 when the war demanded more personnel. She was good at it, efficient, reliable. The kind of woman the Reich approved of serving the war effort in appropriate feminine roles while men did the actual fighting. She'd believed in the cause, not fanatically. She wasn't a party zealot, but with the quiet conviction of someone who'd never seriously questioned the world they grew up in. Germany was superior. German culture was superior. The natural order of things meant men led and women supported, and that arrangement worked because it was based on biological reality, not social construction. The bombing raid that killed her unit in March 1945 had also killed those certainties.
Watching your entire world collapse in rubble and fire tends to generate questions, but questioning and knowing what questions to ask are different things. She'd arrived at Camp Huntsville confused, angry, grieving, and deeply certain that American guards would be incompetent, cruel, or both. The sight of Sergeant Brennan's sidearm had cracked that certainty. What came next would shatter it completely. Among the other prisoners, 3 women would become central to what happened next. Elsa Hoffman, 26, surgical nurse. Quiet, observant, with medical training that made her notice things others missed. She'd worked in field hospitals, seen combat injuries, developed the calm competence of someone who'd held lives in her hands. Sophie Weber, 22, munitions factory worker. Youngest of the group, angry and defiant with the chip-on-shoulder energy of someone who'd grown up poor and learned to fight for everything. She'd worked in precision manufacturing, proof women could handle technical work, but had been paid half what men earned and told she was temporary. Anna Baumann, 41, widow, 3 children. The maternal presence trying to keep younger prisoners calm. Husband killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. She'd managed a household alone, made all decisions, proved daily that women could handle responsibility, but never questioned the ideology that said she needed a man to be complete. These 4 women, Margareta, Elsa, Sophie, and Anna, would form the core of what happened next. Each would react differently to the female guards. Each would resist in her own way. But all of them would eventually face the same question. If the Reich lied to us about women's capabilities, what else did they lie about day 3? Private Rachel Cohen supervised the camp laundry facility, a former military supply building converted into an industrial washing operation. At 24, Cohen had worked in Virginia textile mills before enlisting, which meant she knew machinery, knew production standards, and knew when someone was deliberately working slow to make a point. She rotated duties like all guards, laundry one day, dining hall supervision the next, maintaining variety that prevented boredom and kept skills sharp. Margarete Fischer had been assigned to the pressing station. Heavy industrial irons, 40 pieces per hour, standard decent pay if you met quota. She worked with deliberate slowness, maybe 15 pieces an hour, enough to look busy, not enough to actually be productive. Cohen watched this for exactly 1 hour before approaching. You need to work faster. Standard is 40 pieces per hour. You're doing maybe 15. Margarete set down the iron with theatrical slowness, crossed her arms, made eye contact that communicated exactly what she thought about taking orders from this woman. I am working adequate speed. You have no right to demand more. I have every right. I'm your supervisor. You'll meet production standards or you'll lose work privileges. That means no pay, no canteen access, no additional recreation time. Your choice. Margaret's jaw tightened. Here it was the test she'd been planning since arrival. Push back against the absurdity of female authority, find the male supervisor she knew must exist behind this facade, talk to someone with actual power. You are woman. I do not take orders from women. Bring male guard, and I will discuss standards with him. Rachel Cohen felt anger rising, hot and immediate. She'd heard variations of this line dozens of times, from German prisoners, from American soldiers, from her own father, who'd told her the WWII was no place for a proper girl.
Every single time the urge was to respond emotionally, to let anger show, to prove through volume what she couldn't prove through authority. Every single time she'd learned that emotional response was exactly what they wanted. Proof that female guards were too emotional, too weak, too fundamentally unsuited for the work. So she didn't rise to it. She kept her voice level, professional, utterly calm. There is no male guard. I am your supervisor. You have two choices: meet production standards or return to barracks and forfeit payment and privileges. Decide now. The standoff lasted nearly a full minute. Both women locked in a contest of wills that had nothing to do with laundry and everything to do with competing beliefs about authority, gender, and the proper organization of the world. Other prisoners watched, waiting to see if Margaret could break this pretense, waiting for the male guard who must surely appear. He didn't. Finally, jaw still tight, face showing resentment that would take weeks to dissolve, Margaret returned to work. Her movements were still slow, but slightly faster. Maybe 20 pieces an hour. Not compliance, not acceptance, but the first tiny crack in ideological armor. That evening, the female guards gathered in the administration building to discuss what everyone knew was coming. Systematic testing of their authority by prisoners who genuinely couldn't accept that women could hold power. Lieutenant Rosa Delgado, 31, California former high school teacher, spread her notes across the table. The laundry incident isn't isolated. We're seeing resistance across all work assignments. Kitchen maintenance, medical facility, same pattern. Slow work, open defiance, demands for male supervisors. Sergeant Helen Thompson, 35, former police officer from Detroit. Oldest guard on staff, leaned back in her chair. They've been conditioned their entire lives, not just by Nazi ideology, by their entire culture. German women didn't serve in combat, didn't carry weapons, didn't hold authority. Seeing us doesn't just surprise them, it threatens their entire worldview. So how do we handle it? Cohen asked. I can enforce rules through consequences, but I can't make them believe we're legitimate. Brennan responded carefully. We don't need them to believe. Not at first. We need them to function, follow procedures, meet standards, treat us with the same respect they'd show male guards. Belief can come later, or not at all, but functioning isn't optional. Corporal Maria Santos, 23, Texas. 3 brothers grew up. Ruff spoke up from the corner where she'd been listening quietly. What about when functioning breaks down, when prisoners fight each other, when we need physical intervention? Thompson nodded slowly. That's when we prove competence beyond question, not through aggression, through technique, through training, through demonstrating that we're better at this job than many male guards would be. Santos smiled slightly. I've been training jiu-jitsu for 2 years. If it comes to that, I'm ready. Let's hope it doesn't, Brennan said. But she knew it would. The question was just timing. Over the next week, resistance intensified across the compound. In the kitchen, day 5, Sophie Weber refused to chop vegetables under supervision of Private Jennifer Hayes. I worked in munitions factory, very technical work, precision assembly, and now you have me cutting carrots. Because American woman guard says so. Hayes didn't argue. Just removed Sophie from kitchen duty, reassigned her to latrine cleaning. Sophie went red with anger, but complied. The hierarchy of unpleasant work was clear. Kitchen duty was better. The choice was hers. In the medical facility, day 6, Elsa Hoffman, the surgical nurse, watched Lieutenant Delgado conduct medical rounds with obvious skepticism. In Germany, women could be nurses, certainly, but never doctors, never with final authority over medical decisions. In America, Delgado replied, women can be many things. We prove capability rather than accepting that capability is determined by biology. Elsa absorbed this without responding, but she started paying closer attention to Delgado's medical decisions, started noticing competence that was hard to dismiss. In the maintenance yard, day 7, Anna Bauman questioned why Corporal Santos was carrying tools directing repairs to compound fencing. This is men's work, physical labor, heavy tools. Santos handed Anna the post hole digger. Try it. See if the tool knows your gender. Anna tried. The tool worked the same in her hands. The fence post went into the ground the same way. She handed it back to Santos, face showing the first flicker of doubt about natural limitations. By the end of the first week, tension in the compound had reached critical mass. The prisoners were testing boundaries constantly. The guards were maintaining firm professional responses. Something had to give.
It gave on day 12 in barracks number 3 at 8:47 in the evening when Sophie Weber, angry, defiant, increasingly desperate to prove that female guards were illegitimate, made an accusation that Margaret Fisher couldn't ignore. "You're cooperating with them," Sophie hissed at Margaret in front of 6 other prisoners. "You answer their questions. You work at proper speed now. You're betraying us." Margaret had been sitting on her bunk trying to read a book from the camp library. She set it down slowly. "I'm trying to understand this situation. Something is wrong with what we were taught." "Nothing is wrong." Sophie's voice rose. "They're weak. Women guards prove Americans are desperate." "Proves we were right about them." "Were we?" Margaret asked quietly. "Were we right about anything?" Sophie shoved Margaret. Hard. Margaret shoved back, and suddenly punches were flying. The test Sergeant Brennan had anticipated was about to arrive. Corporal Maria Santos heard the commotion from the guard station. Raised voices escalating rapidly into the distinct sounds of physical violence. She moved toward barracks number 3 at a jog, hand resting on her baton but not drawn. "No alarm yet. Handle it professionally first." She pushed through the door to find Sophie and Margaret grappling on the floor between bunks, other prisoners forming a circle, some shouting encouragement, others calling for them to stop. Classic prison fight born from tension, stress and powerlessness seeking any outlet. "Stop!" Santos barked in German. Her voice cut through the noise. Both women ignored her. Sophie threw a wild punch at Margaret's face. Margareta blocked it poorly, got clipped on the temple, retaliated with a shove that sent Sophie stumbling backward. They closed again, grabbing at clothing, at hair, fighting with more desperation than skill. Santos didn't hesitate. She'd been trained for this exact scenario. She stepped between them smoothly, timing the movement to intercept Sophie's next punch. Caught Sophie's wrist mid-swing with her left hand. Redirected the momentum using basic jiu-jitsu principles. Not fighting force with force, but redirecting it using Sophie's own energy against her. In one fluid motion, Santos pivoted, used Sophie's forward momentum to guide her downward, dropped her to the floor with a control hold that immobilized without injuring. Sophie's arm locked at an uncomfortable but not painful angle. Face pressed to the concrete floor. Unable to move, completely controlled. The entire sequence took maybe 3 seconds. Margaret tried to continue the fight, either didn't notice Santos or didn't care, and swung it where Sophie had been. Santos saw it coming, released Sophie with one hand while maintaining control with the other, caught Margareta's wrist, executed the same redirect and control technique. Now both women were on the floor, both immobilized, both breathing hard, both completely unable to move. Santos held them easily. Her breathing barely elevated, her voice utterly calm when she spoke. "You done?" Both prisoners stopped struggling. The shock was visible on their faces. They'd expected a female guard to be weak, frightened, perhaps calling for backup. Instead, they'd encountered someone who could physically dominate both of them simultaneously, with technique that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with training. Santos released them carefully, maintained a ready position in case they resumed fighting. They didn't. They sat on the floor, staring up at this 5'6" woman who'd controlled them both like they were children, throwing tantrums. 15 other prisoners watched in stunned silence. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Women weren't supposed to be able to do this. Santos surveyed the room, made eye contact with each prisoner. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd just demonstrated capability beyond question. "Fighting is not permitted. Disputes will be resolved through proper channels. You talk to your barracks officer, who talks to me, who talks to Lieutenant Delgado, and we find solutions. Next time this happens, consequences include solitary confinement and loss of all privileges." She paused. "Let that sink in. We maintain order here. We enforce rules. Your compliance is not optional. Your respect for our authority is not negotiable. Are we clear?" Nods. Murmurs of ja and yes in mixed German and English. That night, whispered conversations filled the barracks. Not about the fight itself, but about what came after. How quickly Santos had controlled both fighters. The calm competence of her technique. The undeniable fact that she was good at this job, better than many male guards they'd encountered in Germany. For the first time, some prisoners began questioning not whether female guards were temporary, but whether everything they'd been taught about women's inherent weakness was propaganda rather than truth. 3 days after the fight, Margaret Fisher approached Sergeant Brennan during evening recreation period. Her body language was different. Less defiant, more tentative, the posture of someone about to admit error. "I wish to speak with you, privately, about what I have been thinking." Brennan agreed. They met in her small office. Afternoon light filtering through windows overlooking the compound yard, where other prisoners moved through their daily routines. "I wish to apologize." Margaret began choosing words carefully. "For my disrespect, For my assumption that you and your officers are not true guards. For believing that women cannot do what you obviously do every day. Brennan nodded. She'd heard variations of this before, but it never got old. Watching people discover that their beliefs had been built on lies. What changed your mind, Corporal Santos? Margaret paused, her face showing the effort of translating not just language, but entire worldview. She controlled me and Sophie without effort, without anger, with only technique and confidence. In Germany, we are taught women are weak, emotional, unsuited for physical confrontation or authority. But Santos is not weak. You are not weak. The difference between what I was taught and what I see here, this makes me question everything. What were you taught exactly about women's roles? Margaret considered the question. That women serve by supporting men. That our strength is in home, in family, in creating conditions for men to lead. That women who seek authority or power are unnatural, trying to be something biology does not permit. That societies grow weak when women forget their proper place. And you believe this. Everyone believed this. The regime's propaganda said it constantly. The culture reinforced it. Women who challenged these roles faced criticism, isolation, sometimes punishment. It was not belief exactly. It was simply how things were, like gravity or weather. Not questioned because questioning seemed pointless. Brennan leaned back in her chair. This was the conversation she'd had a dozen times with different prisoners. Each time it felt important. Each time it felt like planting seeds that might grow into something larger than individual understanding. Let me tell you about American female guards. We volunteered for military service. We completed the same training as male military police. Same standards, same requirements, same expectations. We proved we could handle weapons control, prisoners make decisions under pressure, maintain discipline without excessive force. She paused, making sure Margaret was following. Not because we're trying to be men, not because we're violating nature, but because we're capable humans who happen to be female. Gender is just one characteristic among many. It doesn't determine what we can do. It's just one factor among dozens that make us individuals. But in Germany, Margareta started. In Germany, you were lied to. Brennan interrupted gently. You were told comfortable stories about natural order and proper roles because those stories served people who wanted to maintain power. Women supporting men's leadership isn't natural law. It's social structure that benefits those who created it. She leaned forward. When we challenge that structure, when we prove women can lead and fight and command, we're not violating nature. We're exposing lies that were passed off as nature. Margaret absorbed these words. Her face showed the painful process of a worldview dissolving under the weight of contradiction. If this is true, she said slowly, if women can do these things, then what else have I been told that is false? If the regime lied about women's nature, what about everything else? The superiority, the destiny, the righteousness of our cause? That's the question you need to answer for yourself, Brennan said quietly. I can't tell you what to believe, but I can show you what's possible when people are judged by capability rather than by category. Watch us. Watch how we operate this camp, how we maintain security, how we make decisions. Then decide whether what you were taught matches reality. If you've stayed with this story thinking about your own father or grandfather who served during World War II, you might remember hearing about moments like this, when enemy prisoners discovered that American values weren't propaganda but reality, when people who'd been taught to hate Americans encountered actual Americans and had to reconcile the difference. What happens next will prove that competence transcends every assumption these women carried across the Atlantic. Stay with me. Camp Huntsville in June 1945 was part of a massive POW system that had housed over 400,000 Axis prisoners on American soil during the war. Most were German, some Italian, a handful Japanese. They'd been distributed across hundreds of camps. Farm labor programs in the Midwest, manufacturing support in the East, agricultural work in the South and Southwest. The treatment of these prisoners became a point of pride for the United States. Unlike German camps, where Allied POWs faced starvation, brutality, and systematic violations of Geneva Conventions, American camps followed the rules: adequate food, medical care, protection from abuse, work programs that paid small wages, recreation opportunities, male privileges. German prisoners often expressed shock at this treatment. They'd been told Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of discipline. They'd expected brutality. Instead, they got bacon for breakfast, baseball games in the evening, and guards who treated them like human beings rather than subhuman enemies. The use of female guards for female POWs was relatively rare. Only a handful of camps had all female guard staff. The Women's Army Corps had been established in 1942, but combat roles remained off limits. Military police duty represented a compromise. Authority without direct combat weapons, without frontline deployment. But the program worked. Female guards proved as capable as male guards at maintaining security, processing prisoners, enforcing regulations, and handling the 1,000 daily details of camp management. In some ways, they were better. Less likely to use excessive force, more skilled at de-escalation, better at recognizing emotional distress before it became a behavioral problem. By late June, the compound had settled into uneasy routine. Prisoners worked their assignments with minimal resistance. Guards maintained professional distance while enforcing regulations. The initial confrontations had subsided, but transformation isn't a single moment. It's a series of revelations that accumulate until old beliefs become untenable. The next revelation was approaching fast. June 28, 1945. Dusk settling over Camp Huntsville. That particular quality of Texas evening light that turns everything golden air, cooling finally after brutal daytime heat. Corporal Rebecca Hayes on perimeter patrol. Standard duty rotation, walking the fence line, checking for structural issues, maintaining visible presence. Hayes was 26 from Oregon, 5'4" in boots, former track athlete at State University. She joined the WWII in 1943, completed military police training with honors, volunteered specifically for Camp Huntsville duty because she wanted to prove female guards could handle any situation male guards could. She carried standard equipment, sidearm baton flashlight radio, and she carried something else. 2 years of foot pursuit training and physical conditioning that had made her one of the fastest guards in the entire facility. Hayes spotted the movement at 8:17 in the evening, according to her later report. Male figure near the fence line of the adjacent compound. Too far from barracks, moving with purpose toward the perimeter. She recognized immediately what she was seeing. Escape attempt. Camp Huntsville housed female POWs in the southern section, male POWs in the northern section, with separate but adjacent compounds. Shared some infrastructure. Separate guard staff. The male prisoners had their own routine, their own rules, their own periodic testing of boundaries. This particular male prisoner, Hans Richter, age 29, former Wehrmacht infantry, 5'11", approximately 180 pounds, had reached the fence line and was attempting to navigate through a section where repair work had temporarily weakened the wire. Hayes radioed her position. Perimeter breach in progress, northeast quadrant, male prisoner pursuing on foot. She didn't wait for backup. Training said, pursue immediately while target is visible. Backup could catch up. Hans got through the fence and ran. He had 50-yard head start by the time Hayes cleared the gate and began pursuit. 50 yards on a man who'd been a soldier, who had longer legs, who presumably had more upper body strength. What he didn't have was Hayes's training conditioning and absolute determination. She ran, not sprinting recklessly, maintaining sustainable pace, watching his movements, calculating angles. He was heading for the tree line 200 yards out, probably planning to use cover to evade pursuit until darkness provided better concealment. He glanced back, saw female guard chasing him. Didn't slow down, but his body language showed surprise, maybe even amusement. Woman guard. How seriously did he need to take that threat? Very seriously, as it turned out. Hayes closed the distance steadily. Her track training showed. She knew how to pace herself, how to breathe, how to maintain speed without burning out. At 150 yards, she was 40 yards behind. At 100 yards, 30 yards behind. At 50 yards from the tree line, she was 20 yards behind and closing fast. She caught him 10 yards from the trees. Full tackle from behind. Textbook technique used his forward momentum against him, drove him to the ground with control that prevented injury, but allowed no resistance. He tried to throw her off. She maintained position, used leverage and body mechanics instead of raw strength. Do not resist, she commanded in German. Hands behind your back. Now. He complied. Partly from shock. Partly from the recognition that she had him in a position where resistance would only make things worse, partly from the sudden realization that this 5'4" woman had outrun him, caught him, and controlled him with technique he couldn't counter. She cuffed him, radioed backup, maintained control until 2 male guards from the northern compound arrived 3 minutes later to take custody. The entire sequence from fence breach to secured prisoner took less than 5 minutes. Hans Richter would later tell other male prisoners that getting caught by a female guard was the most humiliating moment of his military career. But he'd also tell them quietly, when the hardcore Nazis weren't listening, that she'd been professional, hadn't gloated, had treated him with more dignity than many male guards had shown him in German prisons before his capture. But what mattered more, much more, was how word of this incident spread through both compounds and what it meant for the German women who'd been taught their entire lives that men were stronger,
that women couldn't overcome male physical advantage, that biology determined capability. Because every one of them was about to have that belief demolished. By morning formation, the news had spread to both compounds. The male prisoners talked about it with mixture of embarrassment and grudging respect. Hans Richter had been reasonably fit, reasonably fast, reasonably capable. He hadn't been drunk or injured or handicapped in any way. A female guard had simply outperformed him. The female prisoners talked about it with cognitive dissonance that was almost painful to watch. Sophie Weber sought out Sergeant Brennan during evening recreation. She'd been the one who'd fought with Margaret, the one Santos had controlled in the barracks. She was the angriest, most resistant prisoner in the compound, and she was about to ask a question that revealed how much that resistance was cracking. The guard who caught the man, Sophie said in halting English, "Corporal Hayes. She is small, not physically large. How did she overcome him?" Brennan recognized the question for what it was. Not hostility, but genuine confusion from someone whose worldview was crumbling. Hayes didn't outmuscle him. She outlasted him. Track conditioning, pacing, strategy, tactical pursuit. That's what training means. Not brute force, but skill multiplied by preparation. But in Germany, Sophie said slowly, we are taught men are stronger, that women cannot overcome male resistance through physical means. Men are typically stronger in terms of raw muscle power, Brennan acknowledged. But fights aren't weightlifting contests. They're dynamic situations where training speed, decision-making, and technical skill matter more than bench press numbers. A trained woman can absolutely control an untrained man, or even a trained man if her technique is better. She paused. Let that sink in. Corporal Hayes proved that last night. She didn't overcome Hans Richter through strength. She overcame him through speed, conditioning, and technique. The same way Corporal Santos controlled you and Margareta in the barracks. Not through aggression, but through training that makes aggression unnecessary. Sophie stood silent for nearly a minute, processing. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Smaller, more vulnerable, the anger gone. Everything I was taught about women's weakness, it was propaganda. Lies to keep us subordinate. Some of it was lies, Brennan confirmed. Some was exaggeration of real differences. Men are on average larger and stronger, that's biology. But on average doesn't determine individual capability. And even when physical differences exist, they can be overcome through skill strategy tools like weapons or techniques that multiply effectiveness. She met Sophie's eyes directly. The regime told you women couldn't do things we're demonstrating every day we can do. They told you biology determined destiny. They told you questioning was pointless. Ask yourself why they lied. Ask yourself who benefited from those lies. Over the next week, the shift became visible in dozens of small ways. Elsa stopped questioning medical decisions, started asking Lieutenant Delgado questions about American medical training for women. Anna requested books about American society, women's roles, democratic government. Margaret began attending voluntary education classes Lieutenant Delgado offered on American history and government. Even prisoners who hadn't been openly resistant, who'd been quietly observing, quietly calculating, began approaching guards with questions that revealed deep curiosity about how American society worked, how women had gained these roles, whether the opportunities were real or propaganda. But not all prisoners accepted the transformation. Some dug in harder, insisted American treatment was manipulation, that female guards were aberration that would disappear once the war fully ended and men returned from overseas. One prisoner in particular, Ingrid Volker, 38, widow of an SS officer, hardcore Nazi true believer, began actively working to maintain ideological purity among the holdouts. She spread rumors, questioned motives, suggested that prisoners who cooperated were collaborators, traitors to German values. By early July, Camp Huntsville had divided into 3 groups, those like Margaret and Sophie who were actively questioning everything they'd believed. Those like Elsa and Anna who were cautiously reconsidering but not ready to fully abandon old certainties, and hardliners like Ingrid who saw cooperation as betrayal. Lieutenant Rosa Delgado had started voluntary discussion groups in early July. No mandatory attendance, no pressure, just opportunity for prisoners who wanted to process what they were experiencing. She'd been a high school history teacher before the war, knew how to facilitate conversations that encouraged critical thinking rather than just replacing one set of beliefs with another. The first session attracted 8 prisoners. By the 3rd week, that number had grown to 15, then 18. Every woman in the compound except Ingrid and 2 die-hard holdouts. They met in the recreation building, sitting in a rough circle, Delgado not at the head, but as part of the group, creating conditions for honest discussion rather than lecture. "You've been here 6 weeks now," Delgado opened. "What surprises you most about your experience?" Anna Baumann spoke first. "That you are kind. We expected brutality, or at least coldness. But you treat us with dignity. According to Geneva Convention, yes, but also beyond minimum requirements. You act like we are human beings who made mistakes, not subhuman enemies who deserve punishment, Elsa added. That competence has no gender. I see this now clearly. In medical facility, you make decisions. I would have made sometimes better decisions because you have more training. The quality of your judgment has nothing to do with your sex. Margaret's contribution cut deeper. That everything I believed about natural order was construct, not nature. Women supporting men's leadership isn't biological law, it's social structure benefiting those who created it. Seeing you prove this daily makes me question everything, not just gender roles, but race, democracy, authority itself.
Sophie had been quiet, but now she spoke, voice thick with emotion. I was angry when I arrived. Angry at capture, at defeat, at female guards who made no sense. But anger protected me from seeing truth. My anger was misdirected. She wiped her eyes roughly. I should have been angry at system that lied to me, not at people showing me truth. I worked munitions factory. Very technical work. Precision assembly requiring mathematics and attention to detail. Many women did this, proved we could handle complexity, but we were paid less than men given no authority, told we were temporary wartime substitutes. Her voice broke. Why did we accept this? Why did I accept this? Because challenging it seemed impossible, Delgado said gently. The system was the system. The ideology was the ideology. Questioning meant isolation, criticism, sometimes punishment. Most people don't have the courage to question everything they've been taught, especially when the cost of questioning is high. She looked around the circle. But you're questioning now. You're showing that courage now. That matters. Not just for you, but for what comes after. When you return to Germany, when you rebuild society, when you teach new generations. The courage to admit error, to question authority, to recognize that categories don't determine capability. That's how change happens. Frida Klein, 29. Former elementary school teacher, had been quiet in previous sessions, but now she contributed. I taught children, boys and girls. Girls were just as intelligent, just as capable, but we taught them different things. Boys got science, leadership, ambition. Girls got domestic skills, obedience, self-sacrifice. She paused, choosing words carefully. We created the limitations we claimed were natural. We taught girls they were weak, then pointed to their weakness as proof they needed protection. We taught boys they were leaders, then pointed to their confidence as proof of natural superiority. The snake eating its tail. Ideology creating the evidence used to justify ideology. Margaret raised the question everyone was thinking. If they lied about gender, what about race? We were taught Aryans were superior, that other races were inferior, that mixing would weaken us. Was that lie too? Silence. This was harder territory. Gender roles were one thing. Racial ideology was the core of Nazi beliefs. Delgado didn't answer directly. What do you think? You've seen how lies about natural gender hierarchy served those in power. Who benefited from lies about racial hierarchy? More silence. But the question had been planted. The domino effect continued. Sundays at Camp Huntsville meant no work assignments. Religious services for those who wanted them, and special breakfast that had become legendary among prisoners. Real American bacon. Not the thin, sad strips of fatback they'd eaten in Germany during wartime rationing. Not the ersatz substitutes that had become standard by 1944. Real thick-cut American bacon. The kind Texas farmers raised their hogs for, smoked with hickory fried until the edges crisped and the fat rendered clear, and the smell filled the entire dining hall with aroma that was somehow both comfort and luxury. The first time prisoners had been served bacon breakfast, most had approached it with suspicion. German propaganda had told them American food was bland, processed, lacking the quality and tradition of German cuisine. They expected tasteless grease. Instead, they got revelation. Anna Baumann would later write about that first bacon breakfast in letters to her sons. How she'd taken a tentative bite, expecting to hate it, expecting to prove that American food was inferior. How instead the taste had hit her like memory of everything she'd lost. Sunday dinners before the war, family gatherings, the comfort of good food shared with loved ones. How she'd eaten slowly, savouring each bite, and had cried without quite knowing why. How Private Rachel Cohen on dining hall duty that morning had noticed her crying, approached with concern, asked if she was all right. "I am fine," Anna had said through tears. It is good. Very good. I had forgotten what good food tastes like." Cohen had nodded understanding. "War makes us forget lots of things. Good food, kindness, normal life. We're trying to remind you." It wasn't really about bacon. It was about everything bacon represented. Abundance in place of scarcity, quality, in place of ersatz, generosity, in place of cruelty. It was about guards
who could have fed prisoners minimum calories required by Geneva Convention, but instead provided food that showed basic human decency. Every Sunday, prisoners would line up for bacon breakfast. Every Sunday, the cognitive dissonance would intensify. How could the guards be kind? How could the food be good? How could American values be real and not propaganda? The bacon answered those questions without words.
America was what it claimed to be, not perfect, but honest, not cruel, but strong, not weak, but confident enough to show kindness to enemies. Margaret Fisher had initially refused bacon on principle. She wouldn't accept American propaganda through her stomach. She'd eaten the minimum maintained hunger strike of sorts, proved her resistance. That lasted 2 weeks. Then she'd tried it, and the ideology had crumbled just a bit more. It's propaganda, she'd told Elsa after that first bite, making us like them through food. Is it working? Elsa had asked. Long pause, then honest answer. Yes. But while most prisoners were gradually accepting that American kindness was real, one prisoner refused absolutely to bend. Ingrid Volker had watched the slow transformation of her fellow prisoners with growing horror. She'd seen them question gender roles, question racial hierarchy, question everything the Reich had taught them. And she'd decided that if ideological purity couldn't be maintained through persuasion, maybe it needed to be maintained through force. July the 12th evening recreation period, most prisoners in the yard, some playing cards, some reading, some just sitting and talking. Margaret Fisher sat with Sophie and Elsa, discussing the most recent discussion group session, openly questioning whether repatriation to Germany was even desirable, given what they'd learned about democratic governance versus authoritarian systems. Ingrid Volker watched from across the yard. She'd been planning this for days. She'd sharpened a spoon handle on concrete floor of the latrine. Not enough to kill, but enough to injure enough to send a message. Collaboration would have consequences. Questioning the Reich would have consequences. Corporal Santos was on yard duty, maintaining visible presence but not hovering. The prisoners had earned some autonomy through weeks of good behavior. No reason to think trouble was coming, until Ingrid moved. She crossed the yard with purpose makeshift weapon concealed in her hand. She didn't shout threats or give warning. She just moved toward Margaret with intention that was visible only in the last seconds. Elsa saw it first, opened her mouth to warn. Too late. Ingrid lunged, weapon raised, aiming for Margaret's face or neck. Somewhere that would scar, somewhere that would mark traitor permanently. Santos was moving before her conscious mind processed the threat. Pure training, pure reflex, pure hours of practice for exactly this scenario. She intercepted Ingrid 3 feet from Margareta, caught the weapon arm mid-strike, redirected with the same jiu-jitsu control technique she'd used in the barracks fight, dropped Ingrid to the ground with efficiency that was almost beautiful in its precision. Ingrid struggled. Santos maintained control without excessive force. Just enough pressure to prevent movement, not enough to injure. Professional. Calm. Competent. Drop the weapon. Ingrid's fist was still clenched around the sharpened spoon. Drop it now, or I will break your wrist. I don't want to, but I will. Ingrid dropped it. Backup arrived. Brennan and 2 other guards responding to Santos's radio call. They took custody of Ingrid, secured her for transfer to solitary confinement. Proper procedure for violent prisoners, not punishment, but security necessity. But what happened next mattered more than the takedown. Because Brennan didn't immediately remove Ingrid. She stood her in front of the assembled prisoners, now gathering, now watching, and addressed them all. What happened here tonight proves why we have rules. Violence is not tolerated, against guards, against fellow prisoners, against anyone, period. She gestured to Ingrid. This woman decided that disagreement justified attack, that questioning beliefs deserved physical punishment, that she could enforce ideology through violence. She was wrong. Pause for effect. We protect everyone in this compound, even those who hate us, even those who reject everything we stand for, even those who would attack us if they had chance. Because that's what civilization means, that's what rule of law means, that's what your previous government abandoned, and why it lost not just the war, but any claim to moral legitimacy. Ingrid was removed. The prisoners sat in silence, processing what they'd witnessed. An American guard protecting a German prisoner from another German prisoner using minimum necessary force, explaining the principle behind the action. Margareta sat with her hand pressed to her chest, breathing hard, realizing how close she'd come to serious injury. Realizing also that Santos had protected her without hesitation, without judgment about her past, without question about whether she deserved protection. Later that evening, she would seek out Santos privately. You saved me. From one of my own. Thank you. Santos nodded. It's my job. But you're welcome. It is more than job. You could have let her hurt me. Could have been slower to respond. Could have said, Traitor deserves punishment. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. But you protected me immediately without hesitation. You treat us better than we treated each other, better than we treated anyone. She paused, then said what she'd been thinking for weeks. You are better than us. Not Americans as category, you as individuals. You demonstrate every day the values we claim to have but never practiced. Discipline without cruelty, strength without domination, authority without abuse. We're not better, Santos replied quietly. We just have better system. Democracy, rule of law, individual rights. Those structures channel human nature toward better outcomes. Your system channeled it toward worse ones. That's not about inherent superiority. It's about institutional design. That conversation between Santos and Margaret Agard and prisoner American and German victor and defeated captured the essence of what made Camp Huntsville matter. Not just the transformation of individual prisoners, but the demonstration that American values weren't empty propaganda. They were lived reality. August brought a delegation from American women's organizations touring facilities where female soldiers served. Among the visitors was Margaret Reynolds, 42 journalist with the Chicago Tribune, covering women's military service for a feature series. Sergeant Brennan conducted tours, explained camp operations, answered questions about challenges and successes. But Reynolds wanted more than official briefings. She wanted to talk to the prisoners themselves. Brennan arranged interviews carefully, made clear participation was voluntary, no consequences for declining. 4 prisoners agreed: Marguerite, Elsa, Sophie, and Anna. When I arrived, Margaret told Reynolds through careful translation. I laughed. I thought American women guards would joke-proof America was weak and disordered. I assumed we would be managed poorly, that security would be lax, that female guards would be incompetent or would defer to men for real decisions. She paused. Every one of those assumptions was wrong. These guards are not just competent. They are better at this work than many male guards I encountered in Germany. They maintain discipline without cruelty. They enforce rules without abuse. They exercise authority without needing to prove dominance through intimidation. Sophie added, I was angriest prisoner, angry at capture, angry at defeat, angry at female guards who made no sense. But anger was fear, fear that everything I knew was wrong. She wiped her eyes. If the Reich lied about women, they lied about everything. Reynolds asked the question that would become her headline. What will you take from this experience when you return to Germany? Knowledge that women are capable of anything men can do given opportunity and training, Margaret said. Understanding that subordination isn't natural, but created through systems benefiting those in power. Determination to never again accept limitations based on category rather than individual capability. She paused. And shame. Shame that I believed lies for so long, that I participated in oppressive systems, that I required American guards to teach me what I should have known all along, but also gratitude that these women showed me truth even when I resisted it. October brought cooler evenings, autumn finally tempering Texas heat. Margaret requested one final private meeting with Brennan, not in the office this time, but outside under vast sky that made human concerns feel both smaller and more significant. They sat on a bench outside the administration building, stars emerging as light faded. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. I am afraid, Margaret admitted. Afraid of returning to destroyed city to society that must be rebuilt from ruins. Afraid I will be seen as corrupted by American ideas. Afraid I lack courage to speak truth when it is unpopular. Brennan didn't offer false reassurance. Speaking truth is hard, especially when truth challenges what people want to believe. You'll face resistance. Some will call you traitor. Some will say you were brainwashed. Were I, Margaret asked, no. You were shown evidence that contradicted false beliefs. You had courage to accept that evidence instead of clinging to comfortable lies. That's not brainwashing. That's learning. But what if I am wrong? Then test them. You've learned to question authority, to judge people by capability rather than category, to recognize that systems matter more than inherent superiority. Those principles don't stop working at national borders. They're either true or they're not. I will write about this, Margaret said with sudden decision. About you, about your guards, about what I learned. I will teach what is possible when women are given opportunity. I will honor what you've shown me. Write to me, Brennan said. Let me know how you're doing. You're not alone in this work. Women everywhere are fighting same battles, questioning same lies, building same truths. They shook hands. Professional gesture that felt like more. Acknowledgement of shared humanity, shared purpose, shared hope that moral victories could outlast military ones. Will we see each other again? Margaret asked. I don't know,
but I believe we'll both continue this work in our own ways. That's connection that transcends distance. November 18th, 1945. 18 German women boarded transport trucks for the first leg of journey home. The morning was cold for Texas, low 40s, unusual frost on the grass breath visible in morning air. The guards stood at attention, formal but respectful. Individual farewells were quick, professional, emotional, despite efforts to maintain military bearing. "Thank you for seeing in me what I could not see in myself," Margaret said to Brennan, "for showing me what I could become." "You did the hard work," Brennan replied. "I just provided examples. The courage was yours." The trucks rolled away. The guards watched until they disappeared from view. Hamburg was rubble when Margaret returned. She found work in reconstruction efforts, transitioned to teaching as schools reopened. She spoke about Camp Huntsville when she could. Some listened. Many resisted. But seeds were planted. The first letter to Brennan arrived in March 1946. By 1954, Margaret had published her memoir From Iron Cross to Understanding, documenting her indoctrination and awakening, drawing connections between gender oppression and totalitarian ideology. "The same lies that told us women were naturally subordinate," she wrote, also told us that some races were inferior, that democracy was weakness, that violence in service of ideology was justified. Recognizing the first lie helped me recognize all the others. Catherine Brennan continued military service until 1952, then pursued law degree at Northwestern University. She became attorney specializing in civil rights and gender discrimination, using legal tools to dismantle systems that limited women's opportunities. They corresponded for decades, letters exchanged 2 or 3 times a year. In 1963, Brennan visited Germany during a speaking tour. Margaret arranged a gathering of former Camp Huntsville prisoners in Hamburg. 7 attended, including Elsa, who'd become one of West Germany's first female doctors; Sophie, now an engineer; Anna, who'd advocated for war widows' rights. They spent 3 days together sharing life stories, discussing progress and setbacks in women's equality movements, reflecting on Camp Huntsville's impact. A photograph was taken, former guards surrounded by former prisoners, all smiling. The image became iconic in women's movement literature. To American guards who showed us what was possible, Sophie raised a toast. "Who proved capability transcends category. Who changed our lives by refusing to accept our limitations." To German prisoners who had courage to question everything they'd believed, Brennan responded, "You give me too much credit for transformation that required your courage." "We each did what we could," Margaret said. "Together we proved that moral victories matter as much as military ones." Camp Huntsville was decommissioned in 1946. No physical trace remains of the facility, but its legacy persists. Today, in Hamburg's Museum of Women's History, a permanent exhibit features photographs of guards and prisoners, letters exchanged across decades. Margaret's memoir opened to key passages, and that 1963 reunion photograph displayed prominently. The exhibit caption reads, "When German women prisoners encountered American female guards in 1945, they couldn't believe what they were seeing." What happened next changed not just how they understood detention, but how they understood themselves, their capabilities, and the lies they'd been told about natural limitations. On a recent afternoon, a young woman named Lisa, a 22 university student, viewed the exhibit. Her grandmother approached Frieda Klein, now 95, former prisoner, former teacher from those discussion groups decades ago. "Oma, you knew these women. I was there. Camp Huntsville. I was prisoner who learned she could be more than she'd been taught. Tell me." They sat together, Frieda's weathered hands gesturing as she spoke. "We arrived believing women were weak, subordinate, naturally limited. Guards proved every assumption wrong, not through arguing, through demonstrating. They showed us what capability looks like when it's given opportunity. And it changed you. It changed all of us. I became teacher who taught children to question authority, to judge individuals, not categories. Your mother, my daughter, became engineer because I told her about American female guards who proved women could do anything. Lisa studied the reunion photograph, young Brennan surrounded by former prisoners. That woman saved us," Frieda said. "Not from detention, from ignorance, from lies we'd believed our entire lives. She and her team gave us greatest gift, truth about our own capabilities. The weapons the guards carried were real. The authority they exercised was legitimate." But the transformation they facilitated, helping prisoners question conditioning, judge competence over category, recognize that limitation is often constructed rather than natural, that transformation was the most powerful weapon of all. It outlasted the war that created it. It outlived its participants. It continues influencing how we think about capability, authority, and the work of building societies that judge people by what they can do rather than by who they are. Camp Huntsville operated for less than a year. But its legacy has lasted 8 decades. Because moral victories, victories over prejudice, over false limitations, over ideologies that divide humans into hierarchies of worth, those victories compound across generations. Sergeant Catherine Brennan carried a Colt 45 at Camp Huntsville, but her real weapon was competence so undeniable that it shattered beliefs that had seemed unshakable. Proved that limitation is often constructed rather than natural.
Demonstrated that the most radical challenge to oppressive ideologies is simply living in ways that make those ideologies' claims look absurd. The German women arrived unable to believe what they were seeing. They left unable to believe what they'd previously accepted without question. And that transformation from certainty in lies to recognition of truth, that was the victory that mattered most. The one that would outlast all the military victories. The one that proved wars are won not just through defeating enemies, but through helping them defeat the ideologies that made them enemies in the first place. End. This story honors the real women who served at Camp Huntsville, and those they guarded, women who proved that competence transcends category, that courage includes admitting error, and that the most radical challenge to oppression is simply living in ways that make oppressive claims look absurd. Their legacy continues in every person who refuses to accept false limitations, in every society that judges individuals by capability rather than category, in every generation that builds more just institutions than the one before.